My name is Ada Skiles, and I'm the Associate Director of Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. On behalf of Chapin Hall, I would like to welcome you to our Child and Family Policy Forum. We would like to thank those of you who are here in person and those joining our live webcast for taking the time to be with us today. Today's program is entitled Child Well-Being, a Framework for Policy and Practice. Moderating our panel of experts on this topic is Chapin Hall's Executive Director, Bryan Samuels. I know you will find today's conversation both lively and informative. Again, thank you for taking the time to participate with us today in our program, and I will now turn the program over to Bryan, who will introduce our topic and our panel to you.
Great, and good morning, everybody. It is great to see so many friends, colleagues, and former colleagues here this morning, as well as all of the folks who have joined us online. We have been actually looking forward to this forum for quite a while, not suggesting that all the other forums aren't really interesting, but in many respects, the discussion about well-being today goes to the very heart and mission of Chapin Hall. Chapin Hall is an organization that was created in 1985 specifically for the purposes of producing science that changes policies that promote the well-being of the most distressed children and families. So this is the very origin of Chapin Hall, and it's why we thought that this was an important conversation. The other reason why it's an important conversation is because of the growing body of evidence that focusing on the well-being of children, focusing on normal development, ensuring that all children have the basic competencies across the key domains in life and across their developmental trajectories, we know that that science really matters, and that the evidence would suggest that both at a practice level and a program level, as well as at a policy level, there are concrete steps we can take to improve the well-being of children, particularly those served through public systems. When I was the child welfare director in Illinois about 8 years ago, it's been a while, I had the unique opportunity of taking over the agency after it had experienced a dramatic reduction in the number of children that were in care. And I had the opportunity to really look at the system and ask the question, not how did we get here, but where do we go from here, right? Because so much of child welfare had focused on reducing the size of the system rather than producing positive outcomes for children who are served by the system. And so we were able to, working with a cross-section of folks, both at the judiciary, as well as in the legislature, as well as on the private agency side, we were all able to come together around a focus on trauma, a focus on the impact of maltreatment on the healthy development of children, and to build strategies that promote their well-being by supporting skills and competencies that allow them to engage in those key domains of life and do well. And what was fascinating about that experience was while we had not been talking about well-being all that often in Illinois, as soon as we started talking about it, everybody got it. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't something that folks scratched their head about and said, boy, do we really need to be doing this. It was immediately obvious to everyone that we were in a place where we had an opportunity to do something that was both distinct and important and folks rallied around that opportunity. I left DCFS and went to the Chicago Public Schools. And over the 2.5 years I was there, I was struck by how important a discussion of well-being was in that environment. We typically think about school systems in terms of promoting learning, primarily through focusing on the cognitive aspects of learning. But what we know from the literature increasingly is that the social and emotional aspects of learning are as important to the success of students as is the cognitive work. More importantly, what we know from the brain literature is that those skills and competencies, those characteristics of social and emotional functioning emerge during the same periods as the cognitive development in the brain, so that those skills, those competencies, those systems in the brain and in the body are nestled together. They're intertwined with one another. Said differently, when you're talking about social and emotional well-being for children or cognitive development in the brain, it all works together, or it doesn't work together. And I was struck by how relevant that was as a topic area in public education, and we didn't have enough of those conversations. There were certainly pioneers out there who were motivated and interested and really wanted to do this important work because they saw the challenges that the young people brought with them to the schools. But we did not get the kind of engagement that one would have liked to. But understanding that schools had lots of pressure and lots of other things that they were trying to accomplish. But in those schools where there was an interest, where there was leadership, where there were people who wanted to innovate, we were able to find really concrete ways to really integrate aspects of social and emotional well-being into the classroom and into the school building and into the school day. So the focus of the work that we're going to be doing over the next hour and a half or so is really to leverage 3 individuals who have done really important work. So we have with us Tony Bigland. His bio is included in your materials, as is Roger Wiesberg, as well as Barbara Langford. And what we think is really important about the presentations that they will do is that each of them has spent a considerable part of their more recent days really focused on the application of a well-being approach. So Tony will talk not just about the science of well-being, but examples and opportunities, evidence-based interventions that allow us to move it from an idea that people recognize to a set of skills and competencies that produce positive outcomes for children. Roger has toiled long in the area of social and emotional learning. And he won't just talk about the theory behind it. He'll be able to talk in concrete terms about when you know it, when you see it, knowing it, and where you don't see it, where there are opportunities to promote learning through skills development and competencies. And Barbara's work is really fascinating because what Barbara did, coming from the philanthropic community, was to take the well-being framework that we had originally introduced when I was at the federal government. They took that memo and they focused their energy on the youth who were most likely to age out of the foster care system. And they developed a strategy that represented how to promote well-being for that particular population. And so it's a great example of taking a well-being framework but applying it to a specific population and applying it to a specific context. And I think ultimately that's how we move this conversation to the next level, is finding opportunities to integrate a well-being approach in a concrete way into all of the systems that serve the most vulnerable children. And so we hope that these presentations lay, again, a foundation of active, engaged, and concrete steps towards improving outcomes for children and families by focusing on promoting their well-being. So with that, I'm going to get out of your way and let Roger do his thing. Thanks again and good morning.
Hi, I'm Tony Biglin. The brains behind this is, I think, Chris Jones. He said I was talking first, so here I am. So, I want to talk about, I want to try and summarize what we have learned over the last 30 or 40 years about the prevention of child and adolescent problems. I had the honor of being on the Institute of Medicine committee that reviewed this evidence, came out with a report in 2009, and I'm going to give you a sort of a light touch on that. I want to start with two critical insights. The first is that most child and adolescent problems, the cognitive, the social, the health problems that Bryan was alluding to, are interrelated, that the same kids who have one of those problems are likely to have others. And the second is that all of these problems stem from the same non-nurturing conditions. And that if we can make particularly families and schools, but also neighborhoods and workplaces, more nurturing, we can prevent most of these problems. This is a slide which shows the relationship among problems among 8th grade kids. This is from a representative sample of 20,000 kids in Oregon. Just take the third row down, the risky sexual behavior. This shows the relative likelihood that a kid who says that they're engaging in risky sexual behavior is using substances. 6.86 times as likely if they are engaged in risky sexual behavior that they're also engaged in substance use. 7 times more likely to be engaged in antisocial behavior. They're 4.5 times more likely to be depressed, and they're 3 times more likely to have eating disorders. This has been shown over and over again. And yet, unfortunately, we continue to tend to have both our service and our treatment efforts focused narrowly on, some people are trying to prevent substance use, others antisocial behavior, and so on. But when you recognize that these are all interrelated, you begin to say, well, are there common conditions that produce these problems? And if so, if we change those common conditions, can we prevent all of these kinds of problems? I want to particularly emphasize the effects of maltreatment and poverty on health. And I'll particularly talk about cardiovascular disease. There are about 600,000 deaths a year in this country due to cardiovascular disease. If you want to engage the powerful people in our society who are concerned about well-being, you need to include those who are concerned about cardiovascular disease. In looking at this, I found a meta-analysis of 24 studies of the effects of maltreatment, where we found that it was 2.25 times more likely that a child who had experienced maltreatment as a child, when they were an adult, they were 2.75 times more likely to have cardiovascular disease. And so, that's pretty important. And that to me is a way of engaging powerful interests in society who aren't necessarily represented here in being concerned about well-being. Then there's poverty in childhood. It turns out that leads to adults having a 20 to 40% increased risk of all-cause mortality, a 30 to 60% increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and those effects of being raised in poverty are there even when kids escape from poverty as adults. They still have a 20 to 40% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. With one exception, one study I found showed that if kids were raised in poverty and were then out of poverty, if they reported that they had a nurturing mother, their risk of cardiovascular disease was no higher than it was for people who weren't raised in poverty. So it again points to the importance of nurturance. This is a graph that shows, I have a zebra here because there's a wonderful book on the effects of stress by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And this is a graph of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortex. What happens when a stressor is detected by an organism? Let's say the zebra sees a lion. And that causes a cascade of hormones, which results in cortisol, an increase in cortisol, which raises blood pressure, it raises heart rate, and it allows the zebra to run like hell. And so if the zebra is fortunate that there's another zebra nearby who's older and slower, zebra gets away, gets into the woods. what happens to the hormones? They get reabsorbed. The stress is gone. It's over, right? So why do you suppose that zebras don't get ulcers? Well, consider this. Once the zebra's in the woods, it's over, right? But think about this. Have you ever been in bed stressing about somebody who wasn't lying next to you? I think that's almost a universal experience. Human beings can be in the presence of stressful stimuli even when they aren't there, thanks to our minds, thanks to our ability to think about things. And so that's one of the reasons that humans experience so much more stress than other organisms. And so one of the things we need to do is reduce that stress. This is a picture of my son and his son, and it's hard to get you to, imagine hugging an HPA axis. But as I've studied this, I've realized that, in fact, what we need to do is to be nurturing. In all of the venues that we're in, we need to encourage nurturance, not just among the poorest people in society, but everybody. And so this is my offering of how you can do that. So one of the things I've tried to do after being on the IOM committee was to try and boil down what we know into, all of the kinds of interventions, the family interventions, the school interventions, the things that Roger's going to talk about. Could you characterize what are the key conditions of environments that produce kids who are healthy cognitively, socially, physically? I think there are 4 basic things. The first one is to minimize toxic social and biological conditions. I mean, the social conditions include not just abuse, but even criticism or argumentation or conflict in families or conflict or bullying in schools. These are well-established stressors. And so one of the first things we need to do is minimize these kinds of toxic social conditions. The second is we need to teach, promote, and richly reinforce diverse forms of pro-social behavior. All of the kinds of things that we want our children to be able to do are more likely to happen when we create environments that teach and promote and richly reinforce those kinds of behaviors. The third thing that we need to do is to limit influences and opportunities for problem behavior. And by influences, I'm thinking of things like the marketing of cigarettes and alcohol to young people. There's just one example of an influence that's problematic, but also reducing the opportunities so that we have parents and schools and neighborhoods monitoring what kids are doing to prevent them from being in circumstances that would allow them to experiment with problem behavior. And lastly, we need to promote psychological flexibility, which is a mindful approach to pursuing one's values. I don't have the time to go into it, but there are now more than, this slide is old, there are now more than 70 randomized trials showing the benefits of helping people to be clear about their values and to mindfully pursue those values and not be stopped by thoughts that they can't do it and those kinds of things. So this is a graph that shows, it's a kind of way of thinking about how we could be more nurturing. Start on the right-hand side of this with the primary outcomes, and it lines up perfectly with Bryan, which is, I think, why I'm here. Academic skills. We need kids to have the social and emotional competence. We need also that they have as few psychological and behavioral problems as possible, and that they be physically healthy. And most of these outcomes are mediated by biological mediators, neurological development and stress reactivity in particular. And then there are the proximal influences on these outcomes, the family influences, the school influences, and the peer influences. But there are also more distal influences that we need to be concerned about. Income resources, social cohesion, and physical environment. These are the conditions that we need to be concerned about if we're going to try and produce the kinds of outcomes that we're talking about. So one of the things we did was to try to lay this out according to each developmental phase. So what you see here in this slide and in the next slide is a graph that shows that tries to characterize what are the cognitive, social, emotional, psychological and behavioral and physical developments that need to occur at each of these phases of development. And let me just say two things about this. One is that if you go down one of these columns, the cognitive development, let's say, you see that at every phase of development, there are key milestones that a child needs to reach. And if they reach those milestones, they're prepared then to gain from the next phase of development. But for example, if a child arrives at kindergarten lacking the verbal and cognitive skills that they need, they're significantly unlikely to read. And I know that Illinois and many other states are now beginning to try and track the readiness of every kindergarten child so that we can see if we're achieving what we need to achieve. So there's that kind of dependency from each phase of development to the next within each of these columns. But I also want to reiterate something that Bryan said. If you go across, let's say, early childhood, across these 4 domains, they're interrelated. A child who develops the cognitive skills and the executive functioning is also going to have the self-regulation of emotional behavior that makes it less likely that they'll get into fights, that they will be unable to make friends, and so on. And so just the cognitive and social emotional are intertwined, and you can't have one without the other. Similarly, children who lack that kind of self-regulation and that kind of the behavioral skills that they need are much more likely to develop problems, psychological and behavioral problems. So if you want to prevent the problems in this psychological and behavioral column, what you need to do is ensure that they're developing the cognitive and social readiness to make friends and to get along with others. And by the way, I'd come back to one of the first slides I showed. If you don't have those first 3 sets of things going, you're likely to have kids who are going to have problems with ADHD, problems with cardiovascular disease, and so on. So I think that's probably everything, because Robin says that I'm out of time. So just one more thing. This is a slide from the Institute of Medicine report, and it shows across the top all of the developmental phases. And every one of these bracketed things refers to typically a set of interventions that have been shown to have a significant impact in preventing the entire range of problems, the psychological and behavioral problems, and ensuring successful cognitive and social development. And so we have quite a variety of things. There are just really literally hundreds of randomized trials that have been done that are sort of the foundation for this graph, that we have the knowledge to ensure that virtually every child, if we put it into place, arrives at adulthood with the skills, interests, and health habits they need to live productive and caring lives. And so if we can get this out and actually put it into place, we can change society beyond anything that we've ever achieved previously. Thank you.
Good morning. When Bryan invited me to make a presentation for this meeting, it took me about 30 seconds to agree to do it. Basically, it's like going to Outlook to your calendar, seeing if the day is clear at all, and then saying yes. Part of that was my excitement to be on a panel with Tony and Barbara, whose work I respect greatly. I think we have some things in common. We all focus on the whole child. We all bring a lifespan developmental perspective to the work that we engage in, and we all think about the importance of cutting across various systems. But my real excitement, I think, was I'm based in Chicago at the University of Illinois at Chicago and at Castle, and it was great to have Bryan coming back to Chicago and Illinois. And there's a boundary span, I think, that can go on now that is really important. And if a Bryan with a cross-systemic child welfare perspective, and if I with really an educationally focused but still cross-system perspective can integrate, because we all use different types of language, sometimes different terms, slightly different frameworks. But to me, as I look at it, there's really 80-90% overlap in the messages that you're going to hear from all of us today, even though we cut across different systems. Okay, and I think that that's very important, and we can make a difference in Chicago, we can make a difference in Illinois, we can make a difference in the nation. I really believe if we can work over the next decade, 2 decades, to really bring this work together in powerful ways. Every community must ask the question, what do we want our children to be, to know, and to be able to do when they graduate? And from high school, or, we can talk up through the age of 25 if we want, but trying to think of this from a school perspective, you come up with standards. You need to be able to specify what children should know and be able to do. And we've done that a lot with the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning in collaboration with Illinois, with Chicago Public Schools, states across the country, trying to think about this in terms of developmentally based standards in the realm of social and emotional development. The question that a community might ask could be a little broader, but still we're looking at what we want. And if you talk to parents, if you talk to people in schools, if you talk to business leaders and say, what competencies do you want? Some of these are academic and technical competencies, but a lot have to do with character, with problem solving, with good self-esteem, with an ability to work together with diverse groups. Many of these things are social and emotional variables. And one of the big messages, I think, in the last 30 years of research is many of these social and emotional competencies can be taught, they can be developed in systematic ways, and it's important that the world of policy and practice really catch up significantly with a lot of the work that's been going on for years in terms of demonstration of how to enhance kids' social and emotional and academic development in systematic, evidence-based ways. Bryan talked about more recent days. We've been doing work in this area. For me, that's been like the last 38 years are my most recent days. I discovered my question, I like to say, in 1976 when my advisor from graduate school, I went to a convention and heard him speak. He said, there are too many kids who have problems and there's never going to be enough professional resources to help those kids who have problems. We need, although those are important, we need to think about how to promote positive social and emotional competence and cognitive competence from the start. How do schools and families and communities work together to promote positive outcomes in kids in that way? And I heard the question. I said, okay, that's what I'm going to study for the rest of my life. And I've been doing it since 1976. And I'm going to summarize all my learning in this slide. One thing is it's important to focus on the family. Every kid needs either strong family functioning or support or sustained relationships with caring adults, a mentor, something in one way or another. Adult support and guidance is critical for kids' development. Quality education and connecting kids with their schools, feeling that school is meaningful, that they can and relevant, and they can succeed in school is another key variable to predict positive outcomes. Making communities safe and supportive, having high quality out of school time, also critical. These are protective factors and promotive factors for kids and their development. And finally, providing children and youth with opportunities to build their social and emotional competence. If we would come together and just accomplish these 7 things, provide this for all kids, the number of successful, thriving children in our society would be enormous. Now, within Illinois, there are social and emotional learning standards that have been developed, and they've been around now for since 2005, for 10 years. Okay, these are, along with math standards, social studies standards, English language, arts and science standards. Illinois was the trailblazing state that developed social and emotional learning standards from preschool to high school. Other states, we've done a scan at Castle at all 50 states. All 50 states have social and emotional development standards in preschool. But what happens in K to 12? There are 3 states now, Illinois, Kansas, and Pennsylvania, who actually have K to 12 social and emotional development standards. Other states tend to integrate it in the context of other academic standards or health education standards and the like. But one of the things that I think is happening nationally is there is this trend to recognize that social, emotional, and cognitive development are all intertwined. They can't be disconnected, and it's important to integrate instruction and pedagogy and curriculum in ways that enhance kids' engagement in social and emotional development. But it's also necessary to be conscious about what the core skills are that you want to enhance and what kind of developmentally appropriate strategies and socioculturally appropriate strategies do you want to do to accomplish that. So CASEL has identified 5 competencies, but different people have different models. But to know yourself, to be self-aware, to manage yourself, to have empathy, to be socially aware, to have good relationship skills, and to be a good decision maker about yourself and about others. These are core competencies. Some people call them intrapersonal, interpersonal, and cognitive competencies, but we tried 20 years ago to develop a model, and then in Illinois, the model has been extended to think about what are the personal skills, the social skills and competencies and dispositions, and the cognitive competencies that need to be integrated so somebody can be successful in school and life. The model is to think about how schools and families and communities can work together to promote social and emotional learning. And there are some people within the school system who say, well, that's good because if social and emotional competence can be a mediator to academic performance, improved academic performance, great, then it has a place in schools. But there are others who think more broadly about what is school all about. It's to educate kids who are knowledgeable, responsible, caring, contributing citizens, who are good workers, who are healthy. So the SEL conceptual framework is a broader framework of thinking about what quality education and what quality development of kids across all systems should be. We've done major studies. This is from a meta-analysis that Joe Durlak and I and graduate students at Loyola and University of Illinois at Chicago did it. It was a 5-year project. Again, here's the 5 years summarized in one slide. When you have social and emotional development programs, and we looked at 213 experimental control group studies with pre and post data, with looking at the impact of these programs on kids' functioning, we find that there are significant, substantial increases in kids' social and emotional skill development, in their attitudes about themselves and about school, in their pro-social behavior, reductions in conduct problems and emotional distress. But the big finding for us, which is important to emphasize, is these programs that focus on kids' social and emotional development also led to improvement in kids' achievement test score performance, an 11 percentile point increase in academic achievement test performance. If you look at some of the variables, and this is interesting, we've applied this to during school, we've applied it to after-school programs, and we like the acronym SAFE. But for a while, we talked about the ingredients of effective programs, and we called it FISA originally, because we said if you focus on skill development, and you have time and you realize that's what you're doing, focusing on social and emotional competence development, and you're clear on the targeting, you're explicit about what skills you want to see developed, and you provide sequential instruction in how to enhance these things, and there are active learning experiences so students can learn the skills but apply them in real life and see their relevance. These are the ingredients that are in a lot of the most effective programs that exist in the field of social and emotional learning. We've extended our work over the last couple of years. CASEL, in collaboration with several foundations, has introduced, we call it a national initiative in social and emotional learning. Part of that has been to work with large urban school districts, but we also work with suburban and rural school districts as well. One of the messages that I would give is that social and emotional learning is important for all kids across the board. We are working now in a multi-site collaboration with Anchorage, Alaska, Austin, Texas, Chicago, Cleveland, Nashville, Oakland, Sacramento, Reno, Nevada, Washoe County, working on systemic social and emotional learning? What does it mean to work with the central office, to work with school and school teams, to work with teachers, to work with student support, to work with families and communities, thinking about how do we make this a priority in all the work? And this is a major undertaking that's being externally evaluated by the American Institutes for Research. But the core aspect of this is, what is the systemic classroom instruction that should take place? How do you support the climate? How do you get schools and families and communities working together? How do you coordinate these efforts with mental health and health services? And how do you think about after-school and community activities? So the goal with this kind of approach is basically saying kids' social and emotional competence, their preparation not just for college or post-secondary education, but for careers, for citizenship, that it requires thinking seriously and intentional ways about promoting both their social and emotional competence and their academic competence. So my two take-home messages, one comes from Franklin Roosevelt, who was wise about this more than 70 years ago, but it's never been truer than it is today, when he said we can't always build the future for our youth, but we can build the youth for our future. Part of that is ensuring that they have social and emotional competencies to deal with an ever-changing world. And then the other view is from Nelson Mandela, who said education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. That's a core belief, certainly, that I have, my colleagues at Castle have, I'm sure people in the audience, to think about how the education system can work with other systems to promote these positive outcomes in kids. And if we do this, the world will be a safer, happier place. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Langford, the director of the Youth Transition Funders Group. YTFG is a national network of funders who invest to ensure that all young people are connected by 25 to relationships and supports that they need to effectively transition to adulthood. Today, I'd like to share YTFG's foster care work group's efforts to create an investment agenda focused on social, emotional, and physical well-being for young people who have experienced foster care, age 14 to 25. This includes our definition of what well-being looks like, a framework describing what well-being is and how you might measure it, and a series of recommended investment strategies for both public and private investors to improve outcomes related to social, emotional, and physical well-being for young people transitioning from foster care. I'd like to thank Bryan and Claire and the team at Chapin Hall for inviting me to participate on the panel today and for your continued leadership in furthering conversations around this important topic. So why a focus on well-being for the foster care work group? This is a group of funders specifically working on supporting the transition to adulthood of young people who have experienced foster care. Well, we were initially inspired by Bryan and Claire, then Commissioner Samuels, who graciously joined us for a meeting in the fall of 2011. During that time, when then Commissioner Samuels was presenting a lot of new information and research, really making the case for a focus on well-being. The well-being framework was under development during that time. And our foundation members really became convinced that a focus at this point in time on the issue of well-being was a wise investment on our part. First, because well-being remained a significant gap in the field of child welfare specifically. While the three pillars of child welfare policy, safety, permanency, and well-being exist and are codified in federal statute, few agencies see assuring well-being as their primary responsibility. We also know that youth in foster care tend to have lower levels of well-being than their peers, which understandably stems from their experience prior to entry into care, and many times from their experience while in care. That emotional and behavioral challenges are strong predictors of placement stability. The more times a young person moves placements, we know that's correlated with a number of other negative outcomes. And ultimately, if a young person's not able to effectively manage their social and emotional challenges, it makes it very difficult to develop and sustain a relationship, to be able to succeed in school, to find a place to live, and to find and keep a job. So with that focus, in a nutshell, the foster care work group basically boiled down the rationale for investing in social, emotional, and physical well-being for this particular population into this rationale: that investments in social development, mental wellness, and physical health can importantly contribute to improved outcomes in education, in housing, in employment, and permanence. And those are big outcomes that many folks, not just folks working in the field of child welfare, contribute to, care about, invest in. And simply being more strategic about how we focus investments and resources on social, emotional, and physical well-being can have important contributions along a whole host of other types of outcomes. So our first step in really crafting a definition of well-being was to review a number of frameworks, importantly inspired by the ACYF framework as well as many others in the field. And we landed on the following vision of well-being for young people transitioning from foster care. And you'll notice again that there's many commonalities between the approach of YTFG and other panelists this morning, other frameworks in the field. So all focus on some of the uniquenesses of how we apply this framework for this particular population. So our vision of well-being is that youth and young adults who have experienced foster care have lifelong personal, family, and community connections. That relationship piece remains very central to the definition, that help them to navigate life's ups and downs. We know that life will have ups and downs in a healthy and effective way, the effective part of being able to navigate those ups and downs, to deal with problems, to meet their needs, to see opportunity in the future. A sense of hopefulness was really important in our definition, and to ultimately realize success, to not just be hopeful, but to realize a measure of success as well. So based on that definition, the foster care work group created a framework of a number of domains that we saw as critical to healthy wellness for young people transitioning from foster care. Importantly, we wanted this framework to be broad. It's a comprehensive definition. Inclusive, that it recognizes the diversity of young people in care and how it provides space for how cultural differences in the achievement and expression of healthy adulthood, that those domains are interconnected. There aren't bright lines between any one of those domains. They overlap and are interconnected with each other. That this framework would serve as a complementary framework to many other frameworks out there in the field. And that it's developmentally focused. One of the unique pieces of this framework is that it focuses on the population of 14 to 25. So that spans the developmental range both of adolescence and the developmental range of emerging adulthood. And so that's a uniqueness there. We start with safety and permanency. It includes intellectual potential, social development, mental wellness, and physical health. It also includes the domain of economic success, which particularly for those young people who are emerging adults, economic success becomes a critical component of well-being. So this is the detailed framework. I encourage you to look at the handout in your packets, the executive summary of the report, so you don't strain your eyes with this small text up here. But you'll see that those first four domains are what we're defining as social, emotional, and physical well-being: intellectual potential, social development, mental wellness, and physical health. Intellectual development and potential refers to maximizing a young person's intellectual ability and functioning. They're exposed to stimulating learning environments, are able to participate in activities that spark their interests. Social development is cultivating strong and resilient self-identity, and the supportive and nurturing relationships to feel hopeful about the future. That includes a sense of being part of and belonging to a family. We also highlighted support for spirituality, which is often not talked about in the context of well-being. Mental wellness, being able to manage mental health and wellness effectively, being a full participant in treatment decisions, are able to manage mental distresses in a healthy way. Physical health, maximizing physical health, strength, and functioning, having access to a broad range of healthy activities, engaging in healthy behaviors, having good information to make health-related decisions. And so those four domains really comprise what we're defining as social, emotional, and physical well-being. Importantly, two additional domains, safety and permanence, are also included, being physically and psychologically safe and free from abuse and neglect, and belonging to a family for a lifetime. and the economic success domain, which is, again, critically important, particularly for young people transitioning to adulthood in that emerging adulthood developmental phase, achieving educational success, obtaining and retaining steady employment, and obtaining safe, stable, and affordable housing. That whole well-being framework is supported by a community context that can certainly support and help young people to thrive as on their journey to wellness. So based on that overarching framework, the foster care work group then sought to operationalize that framework into actionable steps that investors, both public and private, so foundations, state and local agencies, could all make to invest to improve outcomes for young people transitioning from foster care. So the group recommended a series of 5 related investment strategies, starting with investing in improving, expanding, and sustaining practice, including investments in the development of functional assessment tools to measure well-being on entry into care, to track progress toward improving well-being while you're in care, practice model development to focus on social, emotional, and physical well-being, a focus on vulnerable subpopulations, including children of immigrants, LGBTQ youth, for example, and professional development for caseworkers to be able to use these tools and models effectively. A second series of investment strategies relates to policy and advocacy, including requiring the most family-like placement setting in making placement decisions, extension of 4E eligibility, which allows for additional resources to be able to support a young person's well-being, effectively supporting transition planning with a focus on social, emotional, and physical well-being, and ensuring access to Medicaid to 26 and other mental and physical health supports. A third category of investment strategies relates to community supports and opportunities. This was a critical area, particularly around the normalcy standard, that young people deserve the supports and opportunities if they're in foster care just as any other young person would in a community. So ensuring access to healthy opportunities to build passions and to improve physical health, removing agency barriers to participation in many of those normalizing activities, support for caregivers, and ensuring access to and effective participation by young people in their care, and again, support for spirituality, helping a young person along their spiritual path. A fourth series of investment strategies relate to investments in cross-systems collaboration. The well-being framework is broad. It spans the range and focus and accountability of a number of different public agencies. So ensuring that well-being issues are included in broader youth initiatives, support for leadership, planning structures, and data systems to focus attention on the topic of well-being, and developing strategic partnerships with specific youth-serving systems, such as the courts, having a judge ask the caseworker in a hearing, to what extent have we been improving social, emotional, and physical health for this child in our care? Workforce and education, mental health and wellness, physical health, transportation, and housing all have roles to play in ensuring well-being. And a fifth set of investment strategies relate to research, demonstration, and evaluation, expanding our capacity to measure well-being, clarifying what we need to know more about, what are the characteristics of caregivers in placement settings that work well for older youth in care, for example, designing new interventions for this specific population that focus on social, emotional, and physical well-being, and expanding the evidence base of promising programs. Just want to highlight the range of members who participated actively in the development of this document: national foundations, regional funders, community foundations, as well as representatives from alumni and youth advocacy organizations. In addition, Mark Courtney from Chapin Hall was very generous of his time sitting in with us for a full meeting and serving as an active reviewer. So again, I encourage you to look at the full document, and thanks for the conversation this morning.
So I hope that what you experience in these three very different but related presentations is that there's a good deal of science to support our public policy moving in this direction, and the application of this science to both practice and policy. When I was at ACF, We had an all-in strategy, which was any piece of funding we had access to. We've moved it in this direction. Every authority we had to help states focus on these issues, we took every opportunity to give them the latitude to do that. And I think in the end, we're in a really important place, both in child welfare and in other public systems. And that place is not one of not knowing that this science exists, but instead a place of knowing how to apply it to the real world. And we hope that these presentations give you a couple of examples of how individuals have gone about integrating this really important scientific set of findings into public systems and into programs and practices. So it's a context, and we're at a really important point in that context. And our hope is that the rest of the time we have here, we can raise questions and have dialogue, not as much about the science, although we can go there, but much more about the application. And so with that, we'll take questions from the room and questions from folks who are participating online.
Much of the discussion so far has been about primary prevention strategies. Working in a child welfare environment, many of the youth and children that we tend to come in with problems already, with adverse effects. What strategies or what models would differ from what you've presented so far that we can apply to these children?
So I think it's a great question. Being the primary child welfare person up here, I'll take a stab at answering the child welfare question. I think that there are a couple of things to think about. In child welfare, one of the things to think about is all of the missed opportunities that exist in child welfare to facilitate healthy relationships and to build skills and competencies. When we remove a child from a bad environment, that's a very traumatic experience, but it's also an opportunity to help young people understand the presence of the challenges that they face, as well as to understand the context in which they're being introduced to a new caregiver or a different relative. So there are a whole bunch of opportunities in child welfare that are already intended to be developmentally and clinically, therapeutically oriented, and we miss the opportunity to do something. When we have child and family visits, that isn't just because that parent has a legal right to have access to their child. It's based on the premise that a regular interaction that is appropriately supported facilitates the healthy and ongoing relationship between the child and the parent. So there are a whole bunch of things in child welfare that we have immediate access to changing the way we practice and have an impact in this way, and we can give you a whole long list of those. I think the other part of what we've done here in child welfare is to recognize the impact of trauma, but not to say that trauma by itself is the problem, but instead to say that child trauma has specific impacts on a child's cognitive, physical, emotional, and social development. And so the reason why we ought to care about trauma is because our children become impaired in really critical ways in order to succeed. And so when we're intervening on trauma, it is not because we're trying to erase the experience that they've had in and of itself. It is specifically to address the impairment that comes as a result of that trauma. And so you take an example of an intervention like trauma-focused CBT for children who have been maltreated. And if you look at that intervention, there's some really positive set of findings that are emerged that say that it has a cross-cutting impact, that trauma-focused CBT both reduces anxiety, it reduces depression, it reduces a whole host of clinical and physiological responses to the trauma. So it's an example of an intervention that says that there are consequences and impairments, and trauma-focused CBT actually goes after those impairments. And there's a good deal of science that shows that it can reduce impairment across each of the major domains of well-being. So it's a really good example of child welfare focusing on trauma, but recognizing that it really is having a physiological and neurological impact or impairment, and then using interventions and practices really to go after the impairment with the goal of moving that child back to a normal level of functioning in those key domains that are appropriate for their age and stage. So it's thinking about well-being not as simply being for it or being against it, but recognizing that in each of those key domains, we can measure success, we can see where kids are struggling, and we can align our practices and our programs to really go after the impairment, which then moves a child back to normal functioning and development, which moves them towards positive outcomes.
If I may, let me add to that if you look inside the preventive interventions that have been developed, and in fact there are family interventions that have been developed from the prenatal period through adolescence. But if you look inside all of those, most of those were developed in clinical settings. They were developed for families where a kid is already having a lot of trouble. And so it turns out that if you can intervene early, you can prevent the development of those problems. So I think the very same techniques that are involved in helping parents to become more patient, to become more skilled in joining their child about what's going on, in positively reinforcing appropriate behavior, and especially in reducing the use of harsh and inconsistent discipline, that those are all valuable techniques. And then you have things like multidimensional foster family care, where a child may go into foster care and may go back into the family if the family's still intact and you can work with them, where you have good outcomes for kids who have multiple problems. So I think it's valuable to sort of get clear about the details of what happens when you work with families on these things. And the same thing I think can be said about schools, but I'm going to be quiet and Roger will probably talk about that.
Yeah, if I could weigh in on a few things here. Very often, social and emotional competence is a missing piece that's a part of all kinds of interventions. Somebody who's mentally healthy has an accurate awareness of themselves. They feel good about their capacities to accomplish things in realistic ways. They're good problem solvers. They know how to get along with others in group situations. A lot of work, if you had asked me 2 years ago in the field of social and emotional learning, where had we turned our attention? It was really, in the context of education, it was to the Common Core state standards. What are the capacities that kids need to achieve academically? But 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting with the U.S. Department of Education, and also we have a lot of meetings. There's an Office of Social and Emotional Learning now within the Chicago Public Schools. Two of the things that are prioritized are multi-tier systemic support and disciplinary disparities. Those connections are going to be critically important. So the question for me in this work, although much of the focus has been primary prevention or universal, how do you get a coordination between what would be called Tier 3 services, Tier 2 services, or universal programming, so that there is a synergy and there's not a disconnect between these things? So I think going back 30 years ago when I was doing randomized controlled trials and working on universal programming, there was a teacher who came up to me, and she was a special education teacher. She said, I would like my kids to have this program. And I said, well, we're doing this kind of with a universal focus right now. And she said, you don't think that kids in special education have social and emotional difficulties they need to learn how to handle better? And she convinced me. There's adaptations, obviously, in the work that need to be done, but one of the key questions for me is integration and a synergy across the services that are delivered to be effective.
Yeah, what was striking to me about the move that I made from child welfare to public education was that the same families we were struggling with in child welfare were the families that we were struggling with at the Chicago Public Schools. And there was a real sense that at the Chicago Public Schools that we didn't know enough to effectively intervene and move children back to better functioning. We had the classic problem at Chicago Public Schools in which 5% of the students represented over 50% of the student code of conduct violations, a relatively small group of young people who were really struggling with a limited response. But as Roger indicated, in developing a 3-tiered model where you're teaching those basic skills to everybody, and then you're being more targeted in your interventions as you move to a smaller and smaller group, we found that many of those young people who were the greatest challenge to the school system made a good deal of progress, and the principals typically wanted more access to the programs, not less. So it is not uncommon for children to be in multiple systems. In each of those systems struggle to serve them well. And I think the science of what we're talking about here has the potential for being integrated across multiple systems, and therefore children and families aren't experiencing one kind of approach in one system and a different approach in the other, but instead one that has greater continuity, and by doing so have a greater likelihood of having the impact that it was intended to have.
And there's a continuum, I think, from school and classroom management and compliance-oriented strategies to work with any kids, to relationally oriented approaches, to approaches that really focus on enhancing youth voice, social and emotional competencies, and promoting their self-discipline. And I think there needs to be a balance where a lot of the work that we do really focuses on enhancing competencies that kids have so they can successfully navigate their environments. There has to be more of a balance, I think, moving in that direction.
So one of the questions we got from online, I think was an interesting one, which is that the question basically says everything the panelists said makes sense, but the question is, can each of you provide a provocative example of what one might do to really move this effort forward? So they're asking you to get rid of the boundaries and think about if you could be really aggressive in introducing an approach here that would move to a well-being frame, what would that provocative idea be?
Funny you should mention it. If this meeting were held 40 years ago, this room would be full of cigarette smoke. This society has changed with respect to a very common practice. The smoking rate's less than half what it was 40 years ago, and the culture has changed despite the fact that tobacco companies spent hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent that. I think that what we need is a cultural movement, a social movement that focuses on making, for a start, schools and families nurturing, all schools and all families, and that we need policies that leverage that, policies that require, first of all, that there's a surveillance system so we know what proportion of kids, not just the proportion of families where there's abuse, but what proportion of families are doing the things that are nurturing successful development. We can do that. We have the techniques for doing that. And then we need advocacy organizations to come together. I was talking earlier about the fact that there are organizations that are working on antisocial behavior. There are organizations working on academic success. There are ones working on tobacco use. There are other ones working on alcohol problems. But if all of these problems stem from the same problematic conditions, we could cut to the chase and really begin a social movement that brings everybody together around efforts to ensure that every family and every school is nurturing. Roger's, doing some wonderful work, and I think probably could tell us what the prevalence of schools are that are effectively promoting social and emotional behavior. Those are the kinds of things we need, but it needs to be a social movement. It needs to be a social movement because, How many people in this room think that there's enough money being spent on the treatment and prevention of the problems of children and adolescents? Why don't we have that money being expended? It's being expended in other countries because we don't have a social movement that is bringing everyone together around the values of ensuring that every child reach adulthood with the skills, interests, and health habits they need to live a productive life and caring relationships with other people. That is going to require a social movement. Is that provocative enough?
Roger, Barbara?
Well, in addition to that movement, let's operationalize it to reorganize how public systems are structured and what they're accountable for. So we thought we were slightly provocative by encouraging policies like ending the option for a young person to age out of a group setting, or to establish and to broaden the definition of Medicaid eligibility for medical necessity to include those who experience trauma. We thought those were provocative, but we can go many steps up to say, right now, the offices, to the extent that they exist around wellness, around social, emotional, and physical well-being, tend to be smaller under something else, and not empowered or resourced to be able to really change and move the dial on social, emotional, and physical well-being outcomes. So what if we reorganized, instead of a Department of Education and a Department of Child Welfare and a Department of Juvenile Justice and a Department of Health, to reorganize around departments of wellness, to think about who's responsible for ensuring social development of families and children, who's responsible for ensuring the cognitive functioning. We may say and quibble that already exists, but how we might turn that upside down and reorganize and create the financial incentives and the accountability incentives so that we're not accountable for things that may not be as important in terms of outcomes, but things that we crystallize as incredibly important, which is the ability to maximize your intellectual potential, the ability to form and sustain relationships, the ability to be well.
Right.
And that might be a way to really move the dial, and it would take a social movement to be able to
Roger, you
make
want to
that
weigh
type
in?
of organization.
Very often when things like this come up, there are paradoxes that you can present. And I would say in 2007, Castle had a meeting, and Congressman George Miller came, and he was trying to reauthorize No Child Left Behind at that point. So this has gone on for 7 years, and we haven't made much progress, certainly in Congress. And what happened as a function of this is there have been waivers granted to certain states because they weren't going to be at 100% proficient performance and academic performance by the year 2014. So California has California core districts. These are districts that have split off from the state and have said, when we have an accountability system, we want it to be 60% academic, 20% climate and culture, and 20% social and emotional learning. So they're thinking about an accountability system that actually is emphasizing this work, which could be amazing and fantastic, or it could be terrible. And I think we have to be careful about unintended negative consequences of doing accountability assessment work in this area. Having said that, the other side of the paradox for me are what I would emphasize is ultimately, if there is a social movement in education, I think it's going to be led by students and by teachers. So how do we give them the voice, the support, so that they can address these things? We did a national survey of teachers who said social and emotional development of kids is critically important for their success academically in terms of their career and college success and so on, and building a better climate in school. So I think on the ground, teachers know about this, students know about the importance. They need the support on up the line at the district level, the state level, the federal level, but how to have a movement that is led by the students and teachers, and to have faith that that's going to lead in a good direction, I think is something we need to see.
Other questions in the back?
Thanks. As a social work graduate student, I'm struck by all of the information that you guys said today are things that we talk about in our first semester of graduate school. If you're sort of looking for a social movement, it's sort of like, we have two tables here. Like, I feel like we've been talking about this, so I'm happy that other disciplines are sort of joining us. And I want to say, if you're looking for change, like, here we are. We're in schools, we're in your agencies. We're not just caseworkers, we're clinical social workers. And in schools, I worked in a school in Inglewood, and I was at Evanston High School, and I ran the restorative justice program. And it's changing culture, it's changing social and emotional well-being. And I think it's things like that that are doing things. So I just want to say, like, we're here, like, don't forget about us.
Here.
So that wasn't really a question, I'm sorry. So here, let me ask a question. How do you guys utilize social workers in things that you do?
Well, there may be a variety of answers. I'll offer mine, kind of with a historical perspective and then a challenge. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and originally most of the work that I did was with school social workers, psychologists, and counselors, and it was very much focused on early intervention, identifying kids who had problems and bringing services to those kids and trying to extend mental health reach in some way. And I think one of the challenges within the social work profession, where if you provide especially direct service and there are too many kids who have challenges and you're never going to have enough resources, if there are estimates in a school of 500 kids that in a disadvantaged community, maybe half of them may have, identified by teachers, have different kinds of adjustment problems. So how do you, if you're a social worker and you're working 2 days a week in a school, help all those kids who have services? And part of the challenge there has to do with how much direct service you do and how much systems work you do. So one of the things I would be curious about is in terms of the focus, the training that's happening, how do we get a balance of and it can be social workers, it can be psychologists, it can be counselors. How do you get a balance between what is done directly, sometimes in one-to-one or small groups, sometimes going into the classroom, a lot of social workers come in and do that, versus how to be kind of more systemic in focus and to create competence within systems to address these issues that I think social workers have a complete handle on how important it is. So the challenge of the balance is what I would wonder about going forward.
Yeah, I'd make 2 quick points. One is, and I think you hit the nail on the head in part, in child welfare, most of our social workers don't do social work, they do case management, right? And case management, for those of you that don't work in child welfare, is not social work. It is playing the role of traffic cop. It is making sure that all of the things that are required to be done are done. And unfortunately, we know that's what happens, but as soon as we start talking about improving outcomes for young people, we immediately turn to the other side of our brain and say, well, the social workers should do that. Well, they can't do that if they also still have to do everything else that we give them. And so part of what we have to do in child welfare is ultimately come to a conclusion about what it is that we're asking of caseworkers. Are we asking them to do casework or social work? How do we strike a balance if that's what we want to achieve? And if we can't strike that balance, how do we build other supports into the system so that we can deliver the kind of support that's needed, even if it can't happen through a caseworker because they've got lots of other things that they're responsible for. When I was in the Illinois Child Welfare Director, we realized that one of the things that we thought was really important was to have a more comprehensive picture of what our kids were struggling with, where they came from, and the caregivers that were taking care of them. So we wanted to introduce an integrated assessment process. But we did that with the reality of knowing that if we just gave that to the caseworkers and said, here's one more thing you have to do, it simply wouldn't happen. And so we had to build new capacity within child welfare that complemented one another so that we could both do the casework that needs to be done and do the kind of in-depth screening and assessment that also needs to be done in order to get to a positive outcome, and then bring those two pieces together. And I can't say that we figured it out exactly perfect, but we recognized that the system was making unrealistic demands already. And if we wanted to do this other work, we had to add capacity. We couldn't just add it to the list of things that caseworkers needed to do. So that's point one, and I think most folks know where I'm coming from on that one. But I also think that we also have to be clear that while there are great social work programs across the country, most of those programs don't prepare young people for the really difficult work in really tough circumstances like child welfare. They show up with the basics, but the kind of ongoing support that social workers need to continue to improve their craft in a specific context is the other important element here. There was one study that just looked at interviewing clinicians who were doing work in child welfare, and the question was, can you name an evidence-based intervention? Not can you actually deliver one, but can you name one? It asked another question, which is, how do you make a decision about what service to provide a child? And it had two, I think, really profound findings. One was that the vast majority of the clinicians said that they decided what to do for kids based on the theories that they were taught in social work, not based on screening and assessment instruments that they were using in a really detailed way to make really critical, nuanced decisions about getting the child what they needed. Not a criticism of social workers as a profession, but a reflection of the ongoing need, even after you have that basic education, to have that skills development done in the context of the work itself. And so that was a really important finding. And then the other finding was just the limited understanding of what works. And that's in part a reflection of focusing on evidence-based interventions is a fairly recent phenomenon. The focus on randomized trials, as Tony indicated, it has ramped up over the last 30 years. And so we know more about what works. And unfortunately, that doesn't get into the field. And so this same study found that only about 10% of the programs that the respondents named had an evidence base to them. So it was a reflection of both their limited understanding of where the evidence base had evolved since they were educated, as well as a reflection of the fact that so little of the evidence base was available to them that it wasn't something that they interacted with every day. So they couldn't name the intervention because they didn't see it often enough to be able to say, I know it when I see it and I know that it's happening over there. So I think that's not a criticism of our social work programs. It's just a reality check about the issues that they confront, particularly in child welfare and increasingly in public education, the complexity of their context and the limited time that they have in an educational environment to learn all the things that you need to know in order to be really effective. And so I think that your points are really well taken. But if we're going to be serious about making sure that our workforce have what they need, we need to be clear about what we're asking them to do. And then in context, we need to make sure that they have the skills and information they need to make the best decisions possible. So I think I probably should be quiet. We've got about another 10 minutes, so we got a little bit more time for questions. So next question.
Good morning. My name is Esther Chamarela. I'm the director of the Chicago Hispanic Coalition and a coordinator of Federal Qualified Health Center. You hear, no?
Yep. Just have to hold it closer to your mouth.
Okay.
There you go. You got it now.
My name is Esther Chamarela. I'm the director of the Chicago Hispanic Health Coalition and a coordinator of Federal Qualified Health Center. I think it has been mentioned the importance to start early and how we engage consumer. My fundamental things with women health is to start early in the intervention. I think it's nothing new. But when we're talking about managed care or health care, we don't see the people go and see the doctor and that's it, and we don't connect it with, for parents, with pediatrician and OB or other, providers at that moment is to start early to engage consumer and how to deal with child well before they start the school system. And it's no system in the Medicare, or we'll see in the Obamacare will be changes where the education on parenting, we involve more consumer on prevention. And I think it's a comment and how much we need to start. I see that every day. The parents go to see the children and the doctor for immunization, but this connection with how they need to deal with children before they born, so that's my comment.
So one of the questions we received online was a question about examples of screening and assessment instruments that can be helpful in the area of assessing well-being as well as promoting progress. So anybody think of screening and assessment instruments that immediately come to mind?
The Annie Casey Foundation, one of our members, is actually in the process of piloting a new behavioral health assessment tool for youth in care. And that tool is unique in a couple of different ways, that it allows a caseworker to see not only the progress of that young person once a problem is identified that you want to provide treatment for, but also enables you to assess the efficacy of the provider. They found that some mental health providers were really good in treating depression, for example. And any child that they sent presenting with depression as an issue got better. But if they sent a child with anxiety to that particular practitioner, that child did not get better. So it's a new tool to really enable the caseworker to see, of the available practitioners in my community, how do I better match what the issue is with what that particular practitioner is good at. And you wouldn't expect that all practitioners are incredibly great at treating a whole host of different types of things, but to better match the particular issue with the strength of the provider. And that's a exciting new health assessment tool that I think is still in the pilot phase, but has great promise for better connecting the issue that we're trying to deal with and the strengths of a mental health practitioner.
Yeah. Roger, you?
Well, if I could say a couple of things about principles of screening, and also offer maybe some suggestions of tools. One of the things, Bryan, that you just said is if you're going to do systematic screening, it should be related to treatment decisions or intervention decisions. And all too often, screening assessments are used for categorization maybe of children, but not necessarily for treatment strategies. So sometimes with screening, there can be iatrogenic effects, I think, if you identify kids and say these kids have problems, but you don't bring effective services right away, then it may be worse than having no screening at all.
Great point.
The second thing is very often these instruments are pathology and deficit oriented, and it creates a mindset when people look at this at the child, well, I see acting out or peer relationship problems or poor motivation to achieve. And a long time ago when we began to do screening and we identified problem behaviors, in terms of intervention strategies, we would ask, well, what's the kid do right? What are the strengths?
Great.
So now there are screening tools on the one hand that look at problem behaviors. You know, there's something called the AML rating scale as one that kind of looks at, with norms, prevalence of acting out or shy, anxious, or learning difficulty behavior. But at the same time, there are tools, the DESA is one, the Devereux Elementary student strengths assessment. And they have something even called the mini test. It's 8 items, but it helps to frame thinking in a competence perspective rather than thinking in a pathology perspective. And the other thing that I think is happening increasingly, which is important in the field, is to look at environmental and relational kinds of components in this, not just to be child-focused and pathology-oriented, but one revolution is to be strength-oriented, the next one is to be context-oriented, and the final thing is to connect the screening and assessment to what the intervention strategies are going to be.
Great point. Tony?
Yeah, I want to bring this back to public health. It's just a natural thing in society that we have evolved treatment procedures. People are sick and we're trying to make them better. People are having behavioral problems, we're trying to intervene with those. And it takes something to sort of back up and say, well, ultimately, aren't we concerned with the well-being of the entire population? And I think that, because the existing organizations are ones that have really evolved to treat and to deal with problems that are occurring, child welfare being one example, there's a lot less in the way of resources being put to prevention. And this sort of comes to mind as we're talking about the issue of screening, because I think of the state of Oregon, for example, where under the leadership of Governor Kitzhaber, who is a physician, they have really begun to transform not only healthcare, but what we're doing with young children. They created an early learning council, which is getting every county in Oregon to assess the readiness of every kindergarten child coming into kindergarten. They're using the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire and an instrument called the Easy CBM, which is a good predictor of kids' cognitive and reading development, reading being really essential. But once you start to do that, you kind of have a chart on the wall in every community that shows the proportion of kids who are ready. And we know in high poverty neighborhoods that we're working in Lane County, where I live, that about 50% of the kids are not ready. Well, what does that say? That says that the community needs to back up and start to do more to reach out to families prenatally and in infancy. We provide the nurse-family partnership to maybe half of the mothers that could benefit from it because we just don't have the resources. So I guess what I'm saying is that we really need to put more resources into affecting the entire population through the kinds of interventions that have been shown to work. Now, the other thing is, I've said there are all these interventions that have been shown to work in randomized trials and so on. But the fact of the matter is that we still don't have the science that we need on how to reliably get those implemented. That's where much of the prevention research is turned to, how do we reliably get this implemented? We're making progress on that. But ultimately, I think we need to take a population perspective.
I think one of the interesting, challenges both in child welfare as well as in public schools is often the role that the DSM plays in a decision about which children need help and which ones don't, right? That in effect, you almost have to document an adult mental illness in order to provide help to children. And one of the real downsides to that is that it fails to recognize that children who may be struggle across a continuum. It's not as if they either have a problem or they don't. And as soon as you have the screen that says they don't have the diagnosis or you have the screen that says they do, that the work is over, right? And so I think particularly as we think about the emergence of mental health problems in adolescence, the reference that Tony made to the IOM report really did make the case for taking a different approach to screening and assessment so that it was less about whether a child did or didn't have a diagnosis, but where they were at from a competency standpoint and the extent to which there were impairments, so that one could begin to think about actually preventing mental illness
by early intervention. And so that really requires us to rethink the way we use the DSM and the way we use screening and assessment, and instead to really think about it from a competency standpoint and think about it from an impairment standpoint so that we can say developmentally, where do we need children to be and how do we intervene in ways that don't require that a child have a diagnosis before we intervene. And that's a real struggle, both in child welfare and in public education. But I think if we can get smarter about framing our goals around well-being, I think we will then have to turn to different screening and assessment approaches so that we identify where children are at and build from where they're at, rather than wait for them to have a diagnosis and only then choose to intervene. And so I'd just like to close today by going back to where we started this morning, which is to say that the role of Chapin Hall in the world, its mission, is to promote the well-being of children through the use of science and in changing policy. And so for me, the conversation that we just begun here is not a single conversation, but instead this is about reaffirming the mission of Chapin Hall and bringing a greater focus on how public systems can use public resources to promote well-being. So stay engaged, continue to follow Chapin Hall, and know that this is an area of work that if you're interested in it, know that we're interested in it, and let's seek out opportunities to collaborate, because we think fundamentally, if we want the best outcomes for the families that struggle the most, then we can't afford to continue to piecemeal the way we intervene and support those families, and instead we have to have a whole child, whole family approach that is intended to promote the well-being of children. So with that, thanks for coming out, and we'll see you down the road.